Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Nichols, and I'm the CEO here at the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I want to thank you all for joining us for our latest civil conversation with Dr. Jonathan Lande, talking about his new book, Freedom Soldiers, which I have a copy of right here. Really a fascinating book. If you had a chance to read it, hopefully this program will whet your appetite and you'll be able to pick up a copy of it. Um, And of course, just please make sure that you're muted and your camera's off during the length of the conversation so we can have a nice chat. If you have any questions, please use our chat feature, as I see some of you already are, which is great. And of course, you can visit our website to purchase the book or view upcoming programs that we have at the National Civil War Museum. So again, thank you all for joining me tonight. Also want to thank our sponsors, Visit Hershey Harrisburg, and Able and Son Roofing and Siding for all they do to help us. And of course, every one of you who's a member and a supporter of the museum. If you're not a member, please join. Every dollar counts. We're not affected by federal dollars since we don't get any. But all the same, it would be wonderful to have some additional support. So again, thank you all for being here. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker and we'll get to our program. So Jonathan Lande is the author of Soldiers, a history of enlisted freedom seekers who fought for liberation in the camps, courts, and prisons of the U.S. Army during the Civil War. He earned his PhD at Brown University, and he currently teaches at Purdue. And his work has received numerous awards, including the Allen Nevins Prize from the Society of American Historians and the William Nelson Cromwell Foundation Dissertation Prize from the American Society for Legal History. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it and appreciate the museum putting this together.
No problem. When I saw this book, as we were talking beforehand of the program, there's so much good history coming out on the saga of African Americans before, during, and after the Civil War. In particular, yours obviously is the heart of the war and what the young men principally were doing. But you have a very interesting take on it, and so I was just wondering how you came about this topic and what drew you to it.
Sure. Yeah. So Freedom Soldiers was born in my first year at grad school because I knew I wanted to do some research related to the Civil War. And of course, you talk to anybody who goes to graduate school for history, and they'll explain that you have to find something new. And for the Civil War, that's particularly hard because there are so many good books that have been written over the years. And so I started to poke around, and one of my favorite stories growing up, one of my favorite films was Glory, of course, one of the best Civil War, if not the best Civil War film, in my opinion. Maybe Lincoln now, but Glory, fantastic film. And the story of black soldiers and their success in war is well known among historians. Especially writing after the civil rights movement, and then having gotten a version of it so vividly depicted by none other than Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman, really made it a landmark, I think, and kind of settled a lot of disputes over whether or not black men had fought for freedom, because it was a question for many decades. Right after the Civil War, they were kind of papered over as reconciliationists kind of looked over this. But then Glory set it in stone, so it became a popular as well as a scholarly knowledge that black soldiers had fought very valiantly in service and earned their freedom through their own force of arms. But what I found when I began to poke around was that there were deserters, and in particular, in one edited volume of Civil War related documents, there was mention of a formerly enslaved man named John Mitchell, who served in the 53rd U.S. Colored Infantry. And he, after escaping slavery, made it to Vicksburg where he enlisted. And then he only spent about a month in service before he decided to camp. So he left, and he didn't return home. It's not like he was a black Confederate or anything of the sort. He found a job as a free man on a Mississippi steamboat. So he was going up and down, and that's where he was found by the Army, who then tried him for desertion, and ultimately executed him for his crime. And so I became extraordinarily fascinated in whether or not John Mitchell's story was one that was in the literature. If it had been, there were many courts-martial cases. And so I made my way to the National Archives, and I was able to look through thousands of courts-martial records. They're well kept, but not in a clear order or anything. So I was able to find that there were, in fact, many formerly enslaved men who did desert, and their stories were not the same as John Mitchell's, but quite similar. And that's the origins of the story. So I just had to figure out then if there were more, and why they desert.
That's very interesting. And you mentioned Glory and Lincoln, and I was my first year of college, first semester of college when Glory came
Oh,
out,
okay, yeah.
dating myself here. And obviously the Ken Burns film was coming out around the same
Hmm.
time. And so you have all this sort of new history at the time, at least, coming out. And obviously a key moment within Glory, and this won't be able to talk about Glory, but is about one of the UACT soldiers um, leaving camp.
Hmm.
And that kind of gets to this question. You think of a soldier joining an army, and when they leave the camp, they desert, right?
Hmm.
You come up. You had I think a term that you've come up with for this book, and you call it a leave of freedom. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and why you chose to use that term?
Sure. So yeah, desertion was one of the foremost crimes in 19th century army in the U.S. Army. It was, along with mutiny, which is a direct assault on the hierarchy of the military, the most serious crime, other than crimes that are serious for civilians, which are rape and murder. So between the four of them, those are the crimes that would most likely get you standing before a firing squad, or perhaps mounting the gallows. So desertion, very serious crime, and one that was tried within the courts martial. And during the Civil War, it was the crime that came before the courts martial most often. Uh, so this gives a historian a great archive, because in addition to them formerly enslaved men as well as white men coming before the courts martial, is the government required well somebody who could write very well to package these items up, take notes on everything that was said in the courts martial, uh, and really get into these facts. And so I started to look through these documents, and what I found was that there was distinctive reasons why formerly enslaved men were leaving the army. And desertion was a term that is a legal term in the Civil War courts martial and the military justice system, but it doesn't necessarily do justice to the reasons that these soldiers are escaping, the reasons that they're leaving the army, because these formerly enslaved men are understanding themselves to be continuing their struggle for freedom after they'd entered the army. So desertion for them was the same reason that, for instance, Frederick Douglass fled slavery in Maryland, which is to reach freedom. And so these formerly enslaved men escape. They make their way to freedom. Sometimes it's only for a moment, other times it's permanently. And so calling it desertion for me felt like I wasn't doing justice, and that it might actually cover up the reasons why these soldiers are fleeing. So I came up with a term that draws on this idea of a leave of absence, which is something that is permitted by the Army. It's an opportunity for a soldier to often return home to see his family, perhaps to get a break at a saloon in a nearby city, an opportunity to relieve oneself from the duties of the military. So I chose to make a term so that we can break from this legal idea of desertion, but then also pull in the fact that this is, one, about their freedom, and two, a military break, a break from the army. So leaves of freedom seem to be the best way to capture the fact that these soldiers are still struggling for their freedom, and seeking to emancipate themselves even after they've entered the army. Putting on Union blue wasn't enough for them, so they sometimes needed to take a leave of freedom.
So that's interesting, and we'll talk more about that as we go in the conversation about
Mhm.
the reasons they did that, why the soldiers did that. But just a kind of a treetop level. It's interesting. Your book is fascinating because of the stories you tell, but also you have great charts and graphs and a lot of detail about individual soldiers or the sort of the macro story. And one thing that I found very interesting was talking about you have a chart on the desertion rates of soldiers, black soldiers and white soldiers. And what's fascinating about it is that through the course of the war, white soldiers, their desertion rate was 10 to 15% in that range. And for USC soldiers, it was 7%. Do you have any reason or rationale for that?
Yeah, so some historians who have looked at this and have mentioned, I think they've offered a pretty plausible reason, which is that the army became, like Joe Glattdar, for instance, mentions it in Forged in Battle, fantastic book. And I think Christian Samito mentions it in his work as well. These are fantastic texts that talk about perhaps that the army became more disciplined later on. So desertion rates were higher earlier in the war because these soldiers were less disciplined because their officers weren't as skilled at keeping them in the army. And that seems to be a plausible reason because, of course, black soldiers by and large don't enter the army until at least 1863, once Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. So I find that to be a plausible reason why. But in addition to that, I think it has to do with the fact that the formerly enslaved men never are convinced that they should stay in the army. That white soldiers increasingly respond to military discipline as something that they should abide by. Whereas formerly enslaved men, while they do a fantastic job and never show the white feather in any mass sense, as was often so much feared by leaders, including Frederick Douglass, but also one of the reasons why black soldiers weren't permitted to enter the army in 1861 or 2, is that these soldiers, they believed that they deserved to be free and that they should be able to continue to flee during the war. And so the rates were never quite as high for white soldiers as black soldiers, perhaps because of the discipline that was instituted early on in the war that got these soldiers well equipped, and their officers were better equipped in the USCT to manage these soldiers. But I also think there's a reason why the soldiers continued to desert within the USCT.
That's interesting. And so, obviously we'll talk about this a little bit too, that there are some black regiments that are formed before the Emancipation Proclamation, not federal technically, as they're more state, but in a general sense, you go into a pretty good detail about where the recruits actually came from, and how many were free men, born free men, and how many were formerly enslaved, self-emancipated people. Can you talk about that, where they were coming from, and what the motivation was?
Sure. The USCT ultimately incorporates about 180,000. The Navy gets about 18,000. So we're talking about soldiers in Union uniform to be about 200,000. And within the U.S. Army, 50,000. I don't touch too much on the Navy. There's good texts on that. But I concentrate on the U.S. Army and those 180,000. And in particular, I see differences between the 50,000 that come from northern states, who are enlisted in northern states, and the 130,000 or so who come from enslaving states, where slavery is there are a large number of enslaved peoples, and the rule of law supports largely the institution of slavery. And what I found is, although there are some free black Northerners who, upon entering the USCT, and they would have been counted by the U.S. government as being from the North, I found some of them may have been enslaved at some point in their lives, including the first Medal of Honor winner, William Carney. But these soldiers are largely, whether they are enslaved or not, being exposed to a very rich political culture that has that African Americans have developed that exists. It's incorporated certain elements into the democracy, but largely it has to have developed on the margins of society because of Jim Crow laws in the North and violations of black people's civil and political rights in the North, which kept them from participating. So you have a very rich African American political culture in the North that is stressing enlistment, because enlistment will mean, as Frederick Douglass says, men of color to arms. This will get us citizenship. This will get us suffrage. This will redeem our manhood, something that had been disparaged for decades because black men were not in the South or North permitted really to answer in self-defense to violence by white vigilantes or enslavers. So a lot of black Northerners come into the Union Army expecting for these broader political objectives and these broader political goals. Now, I found that a lot of the answers why black Southerners, those who had been enslaved upon entering, those 130,000 enter the Army, was distinct, not entirely distinct, and especially as these regiments blend black men from the North and black men from the South, they start to trade ideas and have different political ideas that go back and forth. But upon entering, many of these formerly enslaved men in the South are speaking as though they are entering the Army for very clear ways to get out of bondage. Right, so that means for them, it might mean a wage. It might mean that they have now left slavery, they have a family to support, and so putting on Union Blue might offer them the chance to be full citizens, to redeem their manhood, but it's also very specific to their circumstances. They might need that money to pay for food for their children, or an education for their children, or to support their wives who are often in refugee camps or still enslaved. Or they might also be fleeing enslavers that are abusing them violently, trying to escape torture, trying to escape all of the problems that slavery had created, and a lot of the same reasons why historians have identified as the reasons why enslaved people fled slavery. Because they're being abused, because they're not given human dignity, because they're not given opportunities to act on their own manhood in ways that they think would be uplifting. So the ideas and motivations for black Northerners and black Southerners overlap, but I found that it is often for black Southerners very specific to the circumstances that they find themselves in, where many black Northerners, but not all, but many black Northerners are speaking in the tones of Frederick Douglass or Henry Highland Garnett or Martin Delany, where they're saying, we're fighting for first-class citizenship.
And that kind of gets to the point of how they approach military service as well. The views that the soldiers had, and there was some difference. And I think you touched on it a little bit, but can you explore that topic a little bit more?
Sure. Yes. So one thing I found is that the difference with black soldiers, white soldiers from the North, and then the difference in black soldiers from the South and black soldiers from the North, and it's all a matter of degrees and gradations. Many white Northerners are bringing with them these same ideas of a citizen soldier, that they're coming into the Army, not as professional soldiers with no anticipation of staying in the Army. They're just in the Army until Robert E. Lee and Jeff Davis go home, and then they can go back to their agricultural pursuits. They can go back to their lives in cities and towns. Black Northerners are thinking in similar terms, except they are trying to build that social contract. They're trying to establish that they are sacrificed. They're making sacrifices that will enable them to make arguments after the war that they should be permitted to vote, that they should be permitted to participate fully in the democratic and political life of their cities, towns, and the nation. Now, formerly enslaved men have a distinct idea, and there's one instance, a Wisconsin captain, which just kind of sang to me about the differences between black Southerners from white Northerners and black Northerners. This Wisconsin captain encounters a regiment of enslaved men who had been drawn from Arkansas, from Louisiana, from Mississippi. And when he meets them, he finds something strange. And that is, while many 19th century Americans believed that the military was the most difficult job aside from slavery, that they were expected to enter the Army, and there was, of course, friction between officers and soldiers, but they were expected to ultimately serve the Army as soldiers and take commands as they were. So they essentially entered, and a lot of white soldiers, whether they're North or South, and some black Northerners call themselves slaves, that they're being treated like slaves. Well, black Southerners, this is what this Wisconsin captain discovered, was that they considered themselves, and this is his quotation, the freest of all free men. They thought that upon entering the U.S. Army, that they became freer than any other free person. So this meant that when they entered the army, they weren't seeing it as a moment in the army, as a short break, a couple years, however long it takes to make sure that the Confederates lay down their arms and go back home, like white Northerners and black Northerners. They weren't thinking that. They were thinking that they're now in the army. This gives them new opportunities, opportunities to return home, opportunities to take care of themselves in ways they had not been when enslaved. And this is the way that these soldiers often approach their time in the military. And so, as a result, they're pushing back against that discipline in a distinctive way, in a similar way that they push back against the discipline on plantations.
Hmm. It's very interesting. A part of before you can push back and or be admitted to it to a unit, you have to be recruited. And you talk about a little about how they were recruited. And I think an interesting thought is that did all black men want to join the army? And it's not a surprising answer, but it's interesting. So you talk about that a little bit, the recruitment process.
Yeah, so soldiers in the North and in the South were drafted, impressed by the Army. Black soldiers in the North, some of them wanted to stay home. I found a curious case of a couple black men who were in Danbury, Connecticut, and they had good jobs and they wanted to stay at home. And they told as much when they were tried for desertion in the courts martial. That they had good jobs and they had families to take care of and they wanted to stay home. And they violated the call for a draft, so they were ultimately they were tried as deserters and they were convicted, and so they could have been executed, but instead their punishment was to enter the army. So a little bit different than what you see when you watch Glory or what the uplifting spirit that you get when you reread a Frederick Douglass recruiting speech. It's not the same thing. These guys did not want to go home. Or excuse me, go off to war. They wanted to stay home. And
People are people in the end, right?
yes,
You can
exactly
have
right.
people that are very enthusiastic and others that, yeah.
Yeah, I'd rather not. I think it's not too bad at home. I've heard some of these reports. I've seen some of these pictures. It's probably best that I stay back. And Black Southerners have a similar experience where some of them want to join. They are very adamant about being able to join. That doesn't mean that they're willing to abide by all the discipline, but they very adamantly want to participate. But they're also formerly enslaved men who choose not to enlist. And some of them are able to get government passes so that they could be laborers. And they are persuaded or they have their passes ripped up in front of their faces and they're impressed into the army and made members of the USCT. So a lot of them are eager to join and participate, but there are also a fair number of them who would rather not.
Uh, I guess that's sort of also typical.
Yeah.
We're obviously that these are extraordinary circumstances, but humans are humans.
Mhm.
So with all this going on, and there are people recruiting these soldiers. Robert Small, as you mentioned, as one of the African Americans who recruits. There's a gentleman from Harrisburg named T. Morris Chester,
Mhm.
who was doing the same thing for the 54th and 55th Massachusetts, I think.
Mhm.
So you had black men and white men recruiting these units, and some being impressed, as you would say. But what was the view of white men and white women in the North, in particular, at this point of recruiting black men? What was the range of thoughts and concerns that they had?
Yes, so when the war broke out, many white Northerners didn't want to enlist black soldiers because they had two distinct and almost axiomatically different ideas about what black men could do on the battlefield. And some of them were informed by bad history, and some of them were informed by racial theories. And one of them held that black men would be terrified, that they would never be able to confront, especially their former enslavers, that they would, at the sight of seeing their master across the battle line, would drop their guns. And this is an idea that politicians spoke about. This is an idea that pervaded the North as well as the South. And then the other strange idea that went along with this one had its origins in rebellions by enslaved peoples and especially the Haitian Revolution. And this was that black people, upon getting opportunities to kill and be violent, would be unsated by any opportunity. So they could not be organized into a disciplined army. So these ideas pervaded northern and southern politics, which is one of the reasons why there was such an apprehension to enlisting black soldiers. And when Congress is debating in early 1863 whether or not there needs to be more legislation around the enlistment of black soldiers, there are white congresspersons who are saying we're just going to create rampages across the South with these black regiments, that there's just going to be all of this violence. And so many white Northerners do not want black soldiers to join the Union Blue because they're afraid that either they're going to give up their guns to the Confederates or they're going to kill Confederates, including women and children, as soon as they get the opportunity. And there were some white Northerners who also thought otherwise. People like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who, of course, was one of the supporters of John Brown, one of the Secret Six, although he didn't go in this hiding.
Yeah.
He was willing to support them, and especially after he saw the black soldiers that Robert Smalls had helped recruit. He thought, this is a great opportunity for black soldiers. So it ran the gamut. But this is why, one of the reasons why it took Lincoln so long to decide to enlist black men were these pervasive fears.
And obviously that as you said, pervasive both sides, both Republicans and Democrats in the North. Democrats more so, obviously, because they were sort of the opposition to all of this in the North. You also talk about something called the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission. Can you talk a little bit about what they were doing and what they discovered or reported?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, the AFIC, was a group of reformers that Stanton had hired to investigate how emancipation was unfolding in the South. So they were tasked, these three reformers were sent down and they were asked to interview reformers who had been some of the first to go down. In 1862, the so-called Gideonites had arrived at the Sea Islands and began to provide education, food to the formerly enslaved peoples there on the Sea Islands after the Confederates had scampered inland when the U.S. Navy showed up. And so they interviewed some of these reformers who have set up schools, who have reopened some of the cotton plantations and started to run them on wage labor rather than on enslaved labor. They also interview some of the earliest officers in the USCT. And so what they're trying to figure out and what they relay back to Stanton is about whether or not formerly enslaved people have the capability to be free people. Because as strange as it might sound, there was this widespread belief that those who had been enslaved for so long would not, as I would expect, just want freedom as quickly as possible and be able to use it to the best of anybody's ability because they had waited for it for so long. But in the 19th century, they thought otherwise. They thought that they would have been enslaved for so long that they wouldn't know what to do with their freedom, that they would be idle, that they would be lazy. And these kind of reformist ideas mixed with racial ideas of the 19th century made Stanton want to know whether or not he could support emancipation throughout the South. And so these reformers reported back to Stanton. And what scholars have tended to concentrate on is that they say that there needs to be help, guidance for these formerly enslaved peoples to transition from slave labor to free labor. That they don't quite have a full comprehension of an incentive-based system. They know the carrot. They don't know the carrot, but they know the stick. But what I found most interesting, and others have noted this, but I found particularly interesting to the story that I was telling in Freedom Soldiers, is that they interview people like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who have seen soldiers, who have seen formerly enslaved men in uniform, and they're wondering, can black men in fact be soldiers, and is the Army a good place for formerly enslaved people? And what white reformers and officers like Thomas Wentworth Higginson say is the Army is one of the best places, if not the best place, for black men to transition from slavery to freedom. That the discipline that comes with being in an army, the opportunity that wages provide from the U.S. government to the formerly enslaved, the guidance by white, well-adjusted Northern reformers, which is what the USCT tries to cultivate. This is the best place for them. So the AFIC provides that information to Stanton, and I believe influences, or at least comes to shape the way that many white Northerners begin to see what the USCT can accomplish. People like Charles Francis Adams, who ultimately leads the 5th Massachusetts the 5th Massachusetts colored cavalry. And he comes to see, he has this moment where he's reflecting on what the Army can provide to the formerly enslaved men. And he says the Army is the best place for them. It can teach them trades when they're not going to battle. It can teach them carpentry. It can teach them cobbling. This is a place for them to get the skills so that they can ultimately free themselves.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned this as, develop free labor habits in the military. You talk about labor quite a bit, and
Mhm.
we'll talk about that a little bit more. But before we get to the next question, again, if you have any questions, those in the audience who are listening, please be sure to put it into the chat, and I'll share them with Jonathan. But back to the conversation.
Mhm.
As I mentioned, the free labor habits, but a lot of this is also very paternalistic, looking down as if these recently freed men are essentially children. How big of a role did that play, that thought process, into all of this?
Yeah, so one way that it really shaped the USCT, the color regiments of the Civil War, as they were called, is so when Stanton opens up the federal government, really gets it set up so that it can begin enlisting black soldiers. Because it begins slowly in 1862 with a few regiments. Lincoln opens it up in 1863, and then in May, Stanton opens up the Bureau of Colored Troops and establishes the United States Colored Troops, the USCT. And one of the central objectives, aside from second to getting black soldiers into the Army, is ensuring that it has a specific class of officers. And in particular, they want to vet white men who know how to lead black men. So it becomes very paternalistic. And this is distinguished from many white regiments, especially the early white regiments, where soldiers are allowed to elect their officers. And the thinking behind this is that these white officers in the USCT will be able to train these soldiers to teach them these habits of freedom. Uh, and the distinction, though, the issue comes from the way that citizen soldiers entered the U.S. Army in the 19th century. And as other historians have identified, when white soldiers enter the Army, they largely think of their regiments, the smallest blocks of the U.S. Army, as being similar to families, where white soldiers, white officers, can treat the white rank and file as their children or their nephews or their sons. And this builds a relationship between the two. And this is enabled by the fact that, of course, white men have familial relations with other white men. Well, the problem comes is that when you have only white officers, which is predominantly what the USCT had, and black rank and file soldiers in these regiments, is that instead of incorporating familial ideals in order to transition from civilian life to military life in the same way that white soldiers were able to, is that white officers had to adapt these paternalistic racial ideas in order to lead black men. So sometimes it worked out well. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, while he was somewhat belittling, he very much valued his soldiers. And so when you read Army Life in a Black Regiment, you very much feel that Thomas Wentworth Higginson had the best interests of his soldiers in mind. That didn't mean that some of them didn't feel like he was talking down to them, but many of the soldiers recognized this. But in other regiments, what happened was that these white officers, seeing themselves as well, frankly, the way that one New Orleans black soldier put it is that we have Confederate masters and we have Union masters. And some of these officers are treating the formerly enslaved like, if not enslaved men, at least like those who need to be very clearly told when to go to bed, where to walk, how to act at all moments and times of the day. So, for formerly enslaved men, who, as I mentioned before, are considering themselves the freest of all free men, now they enter the USCT with white officers who are, by and large, at least looking down on them and saying they need some help figuring out what freedom is. It creates a friction between white officers and black soldiers. So even as they're motivated and with the same general goal in mind of suppressing the Confederacy, they have the friction within the USCT. And this is something that affects all regiments during the Civil War, but these are unique to the USCT regiments, especially those that incorporate formerly enslaved men.
One of your quotes that you in the book from one of the soldiers, and why he left the army, at least temporarily, was that he said he was talking about his commanding officer or one of his officers. He was the meanest man this side of hell. So
Yeah.
there's things like that too. And the great thing about what I really like about the book is you kind of lay the scene as we've just sort of walked through, and you get the macro sense of what's happening with USCT. But you do tell individual stories, and I think that brings your theory and your topic to life. So I'd like to talk about one right now that you mentioned, and that was Sergeant Alexander Newton of the 29th Connecticut, I think, USCT.
Mhm.
Um, can you talk about him, in particular that quote, which I think you use as either a chapter heading or one of the subheadings, which is really an amazing thing. But so please tell us about Sergeant Newton.
Yes, so he begins, I believe it's chapter 2, where I talk about discipline within the Army. And he is meant to, he's a black man. He joins the 29th Connecticut, one of those early regiments that retains its state designation. And he is, um, early on, he becomes after well, as the war is ending, these soldiers are headed on the way down from the eastern seaboard, and they're on their way south to ultimately help with the possibility of war with Mexico. And a lot of these soldiers want to go into New Orleans. And there are a lot of soldiers like that. I mean, white and black soldiers, when they entered New Orleans, they were looking to experience New Orleans. And they were excited for a time in this grand city. Uh, but what Newton discovers is that they're not going to go there. And many of these soldiers grow mutinous. And ultimately, they are such that they become quite angry, and they say that they are parts of the giant machine of death. And for him, this is a sign that and this is how I put it in contrast to what these soldiers are expecting, because they find themselves in the army, and Newton describes this kind of reaction that the soldiers have once they discover that it's not going to be an opportunity for them to enact their freedom, to be free men, but instead that they are going to be parts in this giant machine of death. That they are going to be components that are used by the Union government to end the war. And that their personal interests and their personal desires are going to be not considered by the officers, by the Army.
Um, so I'm just looking at a couple of questions here, and one thing I did not mention, and you do mention this in your book, and it's obviously a big part of the movie Glory, is pay. How much the men were being paid, and can you talk a little bit about that, the military wages among them, and how the black troopers reacted to this?
Yes, so the film does a great job of depicting the nonviolent protests that black soldiers had engaged in when they discovered that the promise pay, which was supposed to be equal for the 54th Massachusetts, which was $13 between them and white soldiers, was not going to be the same. That in fact they were going to be paid in Stanton consults an attorney to figure out how much the soldiers should be paid. They're ultimately paid as contraband of war, which is to say that they're paid $7 or $10 and then had $3 deducted from their pay. And the film does a good job of depicting this nonviolent protest that these soldiers participate in. Well, the other issue is that some of these black soldiers from the North are also distinguishing themselves from black soldiers from the South. And a member of the 54th Massachusetts, James Henry Gooding, in one letter that he writes to Lincoln, where he says he demands equal pay, or he thinks they should be released from the army. He says that we were hired as free men, therefore we should be considered equal to white soldiers. There might be a different thing for quote unquote contraband soldiers who were hired or came out of slavery. And this was somewhat incorporated once Congress equalized the pay because they retroactively paid for those who had been freed and then equalized the pay later. But ultimately, the soldiers in the end get equal pay generally. But the film does a good job of showing that nonviolent protest. But there were also formerly enslaved men who chose to engage in open mutiny over this issue because they were not paid as they were supposed to, including William Walker, who doesn't make it in the book, but he's somebody that I've researched and others have spoken of.
Yeah, and another point you make in the book is that there were about 160 or so USCT regiments during the course of the war. About 100 of them were used for manual labor, so only 60 or so saw combat.
Mm-hmm.
Is that all part of the same rationale that there were officers, there were soldiers like William Tecumseh Sherman, for one, who never really came around to the use of black men in the army, as we heard in our last talk a few weeks ago. So is that all plays out, I think, in the same sort of thought process here, does it not?
Yeah, so they're definitely related, and Sherman never warms to the idea of black soldiers being admitted, even after Lincoln says, "Can you retract some of the comments that you've made?" And then other letters emerge that Sherman says, black soldiers shouldn't be put in the army because he privileged this military service as being something of a profession of a very specific kind that black men were not yet suited for it, kind of using the same paternalistic language. So he is not alone. And some white officers and those in the military high command think that black soldiers would be particularly good for garrisoning positions. So this includes Lincoln when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and he largely thinks that they will be great soldiers for holding garrison positions. And this means, making sure that Memphis stays in order. And so many of these regiments don't see combat. They don't get the same kind of training. But that doesn't mean that these soldiers aren't taking their experiences in the army and really exploiting them to live as the freest of all free men.
Sorry, my dog is having a reaction to my cats.
Oh, yeah, that'll happen.
Someone noticed one of my cats, yes, named Sherman, who, yes, is named after William Tecumseh, was in here. But I apologize for the dog. We do have some other good questions that have come in. One of the soldiers you mentioned, USC2, that leaves actually joins essentially the Confederate Army in a way, and that opens up that whole idea of were there black men who fought for the Confederacy?
Mhm.
There's a question about that here. Can you talk a little bit about that individual, and also that, in some ways, myth? What was the reality of black men serving for the Confederates?
Sure. So the Confederacy, like the Union, is terrified of putting black men in uniform early in the war, even more so because they are afraid of a mass insurrection that the guns will be turned on them. So the Confederacy never warms to the idea of enlisting black men until very, very late in the war. And ultimately, some black men do make it into Confederate uniform. They never are serving in any capacity that would affect or influence the outcomes of the battles. And as other scholars have observed, that even the images of black soldiers wearing Confederate uniforms earlier in the war were largely provided by them by their enslavers, who brought them with them to the war to do things, important tasks that soldiers would have had to have done themselves, which is, cook their own meals, keep their uniforms neat and tidy, make sure that the horses are well cared for. These are all important tasks that enslaved men would do once they were in the Confederate ranks. Late in the war, there's an Irish general in the Confederacy who recommends that the Confederacy start to incorporate black soldiers, Claiborne. That gets quite quickly silenced. That's not something we want to talk about. Jefferson Davis has received some letters that we should start to incorporate black soldiers. Jefferson Davis doesn't want anything to do anything with it. Ultimately, Robert E. Lee is the one who starts to persuade him, acknowledging that there's no way that we can put black soldiers in gray uniforms and keep them in slavery, that we must give them freedom. So these soldiers some of them begin to get training from the Confederate ranks, but they never see combat, they never see action. And the soldier that I specifically mentioned, the resources on him the sources available on him are very thin. I have the courts martial record, and that is it. And I believe I have his compiled military service record. But essentially, what happens is he is treated with great indignity in camp because he has a dirty gun, and he's getting reprimanded. He's about to be punished violently. He storms out of camp. He throws down his things. He makes a remark to some comrades. They hear him. He leaves camp, and then he's captured, I believe it's several weeks later, in Confederate gray. Chances are he was not serving as a Confederate soldier. I mean, there is no evidence to suggest that. Most likely, he decided to leave the Union Army because he thought, as that New Orleans soldier said, I've got Union masters and I've got Confederate masters. If I'm about to get abused by a Union officer, I might as well just go find an opportunity to serve the Confederacy in some other way, which probably meant being able to get 3 square meals a day in order to take care of an officer's uniform. That's just speculation, though, because I have no information on that. I'm just basing that off of how most Confederates used enslaved men within the Army.
Yeah, and I'm sure, obviously, you're aware that a lot of adherents to the lost cause narrative look at black men in Confederate uniform as proof that they were fighting. And clearly they were not. They weren't allowed to, as you mentioned, and most of it was either manual labor or manservant or cooks, that type of thing, essentially an enslaved position. But it's one of those things that comes up, as you well know, from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
But another thing you talk about in your book is why these soldiers were fleeing, why they were self-emancipating from the army. Can you talk about some of the reasons why they did this? What was motivating them?
Yeah, so when I first entered the archive, I was curious to see what explanations these soldiers gave in the courts martial. And I was curious to see if they had, for instance, given up the loyalty to the United States, that maybe they entered and they were treated poorly, perhaps not getting equal pay, or perhaps being abused by an officer, and they just said, I'm done with the United States. I'm returning to slavery, or I'm returning to the Confederacy. I didn't know what I was going to find, but I started to read it through a 20th, 21st century lens of the way that, black activists like the Black Panthers had spoken about why they didn't want to serve in the Army during the Vietnam War. But what I discovered, and this is why I started to put these soldiers in more of a context of the enslaved rather than in the context of other soldiers serving in the Union Army, was that the reasons they were giving were the same exact reasons why historians of slavery have identified why enslaved people left bondage. The key reasons why they either left for moments or permanently. And that was primarily to take care of their family, to escape violence, or to take care of their own health. And those are the primary reasons why I found that formerly enslaved men in Union Blue left. And it continues throughout the entire war. Some of them are returning home because their wives are still in slavery. And when they return home, they discover that their former enslaver says, if you leave, essentially it's kind of a veiled threat that your wife might be in jeopardy. Or some of the soldiers discover that their children have been taken away or are going to be hurt. Some of the soldiers as most soldiers who are casualties during the Civil War experience, become diseased. And so they decide that they are going to return home for short breaks in order to get the care that they would prefer. 19th century care very much was a locus found in the home. So it was an adjustment for white and black soldiers to adjust to an army hospital. But this was especially problematic for formerly enslaved men because they are used to white physicians being hired by their enslavers with the objective not of caring for the enslaved, but making sure that the enslaved person was healthy so that they could labor in the field. So many black soldiers wanted the care that they could trust, not care from a white physician who might simply be taking care of them as a field laborer. And then the other was like John Mitchell because they said they had been kicked and cuffed.
Hmm. So all of these are rationale, and many of them also state, and or at least they share this during their court martial, that they were planning to come back. They were not thinking of this as a true desertion where they're going, leaving, and with no plan of returning. It was, again, part of that, as you discussed, that process of gaining their freedom from slavery. And of course, if you're in the United States Army and you're an officer, that may not cut the mustard. And
Right.
so there are these courts martial. Can you talk about that a little bit? What the process was, what the African American men faced, and was it any different, or were they treated differently than white soldiers?
Yes, so in the courts martial, specifically well, for all soldiers, they face in the U.S. courts martial a tribunal of jurors who are all officers, which meant if the Union Army was composed primarily of white officers, that black soldiers were always being tried by white officers. But they were being tried by these officers they had a judge advocate who was meant to manage the trial and press the charges against the soldier. The soldier did not have, as we have in a civilian court system, necessarily an opportunity for justice in the same way. The expectation there for the courts martial was to ensure discipline. And Sherman has got a great quotation after the war. I don't think it made it into the book, but he essentially says the military justice system is meant to make soldiers, not to deal with justice. And so there might be a chance that you get justice, but the objective was discipline to make sure that soldiers were in uniform and on the line when you needed them to press the enemy. And so for desertion, this is why it was such a major problem for the U.S. Army with these soldiers leaving and coming and going. And for white soldiers, it happened similarly, especially early in the war, where they were returning home for short breaks or going out to grog shops to have a good time or trading with the enemy or going to look for food. And so what the Army ultimately does is it begins to try these soldiers. But there is a cultural perception, I think, that desertion is a sign of waning loyalty, of soldiers not having the same full loyalty to the army. And desertion wasn't always that case. Desertion was often simply these human matters, very simple, very basic. And the courts martial tried these soldiers as if they were violating labor contracts, because when a soldier entered the army, it might have been for patriotic reasons, but they ended up signing enlistment contracts that function just the way labor contracts would in today's culture, where you sign for a period and then you're released from service, you're promised a certain wage, and you're given that. So when they enter the courts martial, black soldiers and white soldiers are largely tried with the same exact idea that these soldiers have violated their enlistment contract. They promised to do their duty. They promised to stay in camp. They promised to be ready to fight when necessary. They broke that rule, and therefore they need to be punished for it, for violating that contract, not for having disloyal feelings towards the United States, not for not showing proper respect for Abraham Lincoln. It was because they had violated that contract, and that was the way that the courts martial prosecuted it as a labor contract in pursuit of maintaining discipline.
So the way USC troops were treated versus white troops is very similar, it sounds.
Yes, yes, and it was profound. It was a profound transition from what, especially the formerly enslaved men had experienced, because they could expect to have equal opportunities for justice. And a lot of scholars have identified this, the fact that the Civil War opened up these grand opportunities for black men to have equal justice within the courts martial. The trouble comes is that the white officers are imposing their ideas of freedom, which are bound to wage labor notions of freedom, on formerly enslaved men who are only now adjusting to what freedom means. And more importantly, and for most of them, they are struggling for freedom. They don't see this as a wage labor contract violation. They see this as an opportunity to exercise the freedom that they have just won. So it creates friction because there are distinctive approaches to how the courts martial should operate for the formerly enslaved and for white jurors who are sitting in judgment of them.
Very interesting. Um, so if I some 12,400 or so black men deserted from the army, many were brought back, tried, and many found guilty, and they served terms, usually manual labor. It seemed like.
Mhm.
What am I correct? That was only one that was executed, or were there more?
Yeah, there was one confirmed case, and it gets a little dicey to figure out how many were deserted. Because, for instance, Montgomery and Robert Gould Shaw in his letters reflects on this. Two men are brought in who had deserted from Montgomery's second South Carolina Colored Infantry, and Montgomery shoots them on the spot.
Hmm.
So executions could be drumhead courts martial. They didn't necessarily have to go through the full process, but most of the soldiers end up in military prisons.
And what was the appeal process like for them? Was there one?
So the soldiers, if they were tried in the courts martial for serious crimes like this, would have their courts cases reviewed by the Union Army. So they would go through them, make sure that there were no discrepancies, no issues with the cases. And of course, Lincoln became famous for spending marathon hours reviewing courts martial cases as well. And these are largely for soldiers who were going to be executed. You know, of course, the famous sleeping sentinel. Which comes from Lincoln pardoning soldiers who fell asleep at their post. But soldiers also, in addition to the Union Army taking the opportunity to review these cases, soldiers also appealed directly to the Union High Command, including Lincoln. And some of them would get officers who were in the courts to write them letters, many of them formerly enslaved men being illiterate or unable to find, in a military prison when you're at hard labor, to find a pen and paper, I'm sure was not easy. There's no clear evidence that they didn't have it, but I'm sure it was difficult. So they would make friends, they would appeal to others, and they would send these letters to Union officials saying that their cases should be reviewed again, that they should be released from prison.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, some of them went directly to Abraham Lincoln. I think Isaiah Price, one of the USCT soldiers, who
Mhm.
eventually was, I think Lincoln passed on providing clemency for him, but there are others. And there's one really interesting piece you talk about for the appeal process. Uh, and this is a quote from your book: from November of 1863 to March of 1865, Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt personally reviewed 34,000 cases. He was a busy guy, and obviously black and white men, right?
Yeah.
So it was definitely a full-time job.
Uh-huh.
Before
No
we
kidding.
wrap up, I do have a few additional questions that have been
Uh-huh.
coming in that I'd like to share from the audience. One person talks about Harry Tubman, who served on the Combahee River raid, amongst other things. Were there any black women that you came across that were serving, as there were some white women who did?
Yes, so the number is three black women have been identified, not by name, but there is evidence of them. And actually, when I was doing research at the first evidence I came across was I was doing research at the Connecticut Historical Society, and they have some letters from a black soldier who describes a woman. Actually, they didn't know she was a woman, and she they discover all of a sudden that she's pregnant. So she was a black woman serving in a black regiment. Um, and the other two the specificity doesn't come to mind, but there were three recorded black women that served. in an official capacity who are discovered.
It's really amazing
Yeah.
um, to run across those and those stories. Um, Another question was earlier on the USCT troops from southern states, from slave states, were
Mhm.
the all of them or the vast majority former enslaved people, or were there some others?
There were some free black people who joined from the Confederate States. The numbers are, I don't think there are any clear numbers on how many of them had been enslaved or not. So when I was doing research, I had to comb through the courts martial records and the compiled military service records. And some of them make note, for instance, a lot of them in Kentucky, because it was a border state, make note if an enslaver had given them permission to enlist, and then the enslaver got money from the federal government for that person to serve. So some of them are quite clear if they had been enslaved or not, but a lot of them simply say field hand, laborer. So it's unclear whether they had been free or not free in the South, but there are some.
A point of clarification on the female question. The person asked, is it three black women in addition to Harriet Tubman and her role? Yes. Okay.
Yes, I believe, because I don't, Harriet Tubman didn't have a union uniform. So
Right.
it's three women in union uniform, and I
Okay.
believe
So
this is
they were actually in a unit serving and then were discovered, unlike her who
exactly.
was leading, helping to lead or navigate the raid. Um,
Exactly. Hmm.
what was the most surprising thing you found in the course of your research?
That's a good one. Um, Well, I think so. So one of the surprises that I don't know if it was the most surprising. I'd have to really rack my brain around that one. But one of the surprising ones, and this is how I conclude the whole book, is with a case of a black soldier who had deserted. He'd been labeled a deserter because he was ill, and he decided to go home. And when I started to look into his case, he had later appealed to have the desertion label removed so that he could apply for a pension. Um, and he had been fully sick. He admitted that he left. Um, and then what I found when I was looking through the pension application was that one of his comrades, who had been in the regiment, had fought the entire time with the regiment, had seen combat. This soldier had not. Joseph Williams was his name. Joseph Williams got ill before he ever got a chance to see combat. He largely was a soldier in a garrison role. But the soldier, his comrade who had seen battle, writes to in support of having the desertion term removed. And he reports this combat tested soldier reports that he learned from community members who knew Joseph Williams that he wanted to return to his regiment, but he really couldn't because he was too ill. And so he holds nothing, he holds no grudges against Joseph Williams for not returning to his regiment or for not staying with the regiment in the first place. But in fact, and this is why I think that there is a general sense, even if 7% of black men had deserted the army, that it kind of pervades these regiments in ways that we cannot necessarily identify, that there was greater support for these men to come and go because this battle-tested soldier did not have a problem with his peer returning home because he thought it perfectly acceptable that after a life in bondage, that if he becomes ill, that he shouldn't be kept at labor despite his illness, that he should be permitted to return home to care for himself because that's what he should do as a free man.
Uh, Time for two more quick questions.
Oh,
One is this may not be a quick one, but something gives someone asked for any research pointers, best practices. I assume doing research on USCT in particular. Do you have any pointers you can share with our audience here?
um, there are a lot of good published sources. So I think one place to start would be to see like On the Altar of Freedom, which is a collection of letters from James Henry Gooding. Um, There are also good sources that you can find on Fold 3 that include the compiled military service records. And these, at first glance, might seem fairly basic, but once you start to dig into them, you can start to see how old the soldiers were, what jobs they had, where they came from. As I mentioned with some of the Kentucky soldiers, if they had been enslaved. which means there's an interesting negotiation going on between the U.S. Army, the enslavers, and the enslaved about who should serve and who should be free. And then if you get a chance, check out the courts-martial records in Washington, D.C., because they are just chocked full of information. They're fascinating. It's one of these rare sources that captures the voices of enslaved men who never were and probably never became, in many instances, because they didn't leave any memoirs or stories of their service, never became literate. But because of the specific rules around recording the testimony of black men or of any men in the courts martial, you have illiterate, formerly enslaved men who, in some cases, are only weeks out of bondage, proclaiming why specifically they decided to become free. So they have these whole page, in some cases, descriptions about this is why I enlisted, this is why I deserted, this is my feelings toward slavery, this is my feelings toward the Union government. So if you get a chance, dig into those courts-martial records because they are fascinating pieces. And there have been some scholars who've done great work on them, but I think there's still a lot that can be done in those courts-martial records.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And then one final piece: what's the legacy? What do you want people to take away from reading this story?
So I think, I mean, I'll return back to that narrative of slavery to freedom that is so clearly delineated in the historical literature and in the film Glory. And in new work that's even being written now about the transition from slavery to freedom, suggesting that as soon as black men entered the Union ranks, that they became free, that it was a glorified experience, that freedom was established upon entering the U.S. Army. And one thing, the key takeaway, the thing that I want to make sure that is known about the USCT in relation to my research, because it's just building on what scholars have already told us, is that emancipation in the U.S. Army was a process, much like it was for civilians who are in refugee camps. And that process meant that there were obstacles that were always in their way, that sometimes they might take 2 steps towards freedom and then 10 steps back. I had some soldiers who would leave to go help their mothers, which is probably something a lot of these men always wanted to do, but as enslaved men never could. So they get this opportunity, they go home to take care of their mothers. And then on their way back to camp after taking a leave of freedom, they are captured by Confederate pickets who then ship them off to Texas as enslaved people again. And then they have to make their way all the way back to their regiment in Arkansas. And so these soldiers, the story of slavery to freedom is even more capacious and comprehensive if you look at soldiers who don't serve in the fantastical and very important but fantastical regiments like the 54th Massachusetts. That the stories of soldiers who never mounted the parapet at Fort Wagner, who never fought bravely at Milliken's Bend, or who perhaps just deserted from Milliken's Bend, that their story of freedom is an important one to be told alongside those other stories.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave this. Again, the book is Freedom Soldiers. You can buy it here at our museum, or, of course, anywhere that you buy books, hopefully from an independent bookstore. But either way, pick it up. It's great for research too if you're conducting research. So, Jonathan, thank you for a wonderful discussion, for taking the time with us today. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it. And in all the questions as well. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Yes, and thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time. Have a great evening. Take care.
John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John